Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on when you are tuning in to WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. This is the Montpelier Happy Hour. I am the host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. We starting with a lovely conversation with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser about the series of shows we have on deck. And then probably in about 5-10 minutes, we'll be joined by Representative Peter Conlon, who is our guest today. Now, Emily, welcome.
Thanks, Olga.
We have a few guests lined up to sort of prepare us for the upcoming session, and many of them will be talking about the committee work they're doing. Help us frame that, because you're the one who suggested this series.
Yeah, so as much discussed on previous shows and in hot takes in Vermont Digger or wherever else people get their news, there's a lot of change in the State House this year. We have we're gonna have a new pro tem in the Senate, and we're having the largest turnover in both sort of regular House members, but even more importantly, not more importantly, but more unusually, I guess, and disruptively, chairs of committees. And a lot of our committee chairs in the House, especially, not as much in the Senate, but this is happening in the Senate, served for a very long time and all retired this last year. And so there's gonna be a lot of change, both culturally and then just in sort of in terms of how the work goes, how priorities are set, all of those things, a lot of new relationships to form. We're anticipating getting off to a slow and careful start as we learn each other and learn new habits and find new ways of being together. We have not had a sort of beginning of the session swearing in person for 4 years.
Wow, is it really 4 years now?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, and so even that is going to be momentous to some degree. And so these next series of shows, there's also this other confusion in the whole thing that I should add. Committee assignments and committee chairs are not announced until the beginning of the session.
Right. So there's even flux on who's going to have what position or which committee they're going to be.
It's a formal announcement to the House Assembly.
Yep.
And in normal years, there's just sort of even in changes in the biennium, there's there's just an assumption that the person who was chair last year will be the chair next year if they're coming back. And most of the people on the committee, unless they've said something, would probably stay on that committee for the next year. And so as folks are getting their legislation ready, as advocates are getting their campaigns ready, there's a sense of what the universe they'll be dealing with will look like and who they need to talk to. That is not at all true this year. So we have a whole lot of vice chairs and ranking members of committees who might become chairs, some who are more rumored to become chairs than others. There are some committees where both the chair and the vice chair, who was sort of imagined to be the next chair, have both resigned. That happened on the Appropriations Committee. And so that creates a whole other jigsaw puzzle of maybe another chair needs to be pulled over to be that chair, and then that chair would be empty.
Right.
So with all of that maneuvering, which I'm sure sounds like nonsense to your average person on the street, but it just means that there's a lot changing, a lot that's not anticipated, a lot of gossiping with very, very important results. What we're doing for the next month is inviting folks onto the show who have had a leadership role in their committees, who are anticipated to be staying on that committee, to talk about what they see in the upcoming session. They don't know who else will be on their committee, probably. They might not know if they're going to be chair or not, but they have a context for that committee and they have ideas for the future. And so that's who we're talking to these upcoming.
Thank you. And let's take a minute. I think some people may not understand or appreciate why we care what the committees are doing.
Oh, yes. Good point.
Because that's where a lot of the work, actually all the work happens. We dramatize the floor.
Yeah.
And what happens on the floor of the House or the Senate, but the committees is where things get done.
Good point. Thank you. Let's explain the legislative process a little bit, and like not Schoolhouse Rock style, but like just like basic.
We really did our jazz hands this morning for
it. Folks who are tuning into the podcast and didn't see our Facebook Live might not realize that Olga disappeared off my computer about 10 times when I was trying to get this started. So what happens on the House floor, as Olga said, is not just dramatized, it's just straight drama. If something comes to the House floor, it is 99% chance it's going to pass. The floor speeches are rarely designed to convince anyone in one direction or another. They're generally designed to like state claims on the issue.
Right. Talk to the constituents.
It's a conversation with constituents. It's a conversation with other members to sort of justify policy positions long term and to like lay claims to narratives. But it is, if it comes to, generally things do not come to the floor unless they are anticipated to pass. That is not true in every state. Some states have rules in place that every single bill needs to come to the floor for a vote. Not true in Vermont. So where all of the decision making about if the thing is going to come to the floor or not happens is in the committee. So representatives sponsor bills. Those bills get sent by the speaker. All bills get sent by the speaker to a committee. They go to the committee and they sit on what is called the committee wall, which is a genuine wall. And on that genuine wall is like a list of all of the bills. And they all have these like their own little slip of paper that's like, I don't know, like 2 by 3 inches that has the name of the bill and the sponsors on it. And then it is up to the chair of the committee generally whether or not that bill gets taken off the wall and discussed in the committee. Some committees and committee chairs make a like very concerted effort to have at least a 15-minute slot for every single bill on their wall to hear what it's about and why the sponsor sponsored it. Some committees absolutely only take bills off the wall if they're planning to like really act on them and discuss them and dive into them and likely pass them. That is absolutely a decision made by committee culture and the committee chair generally. So if a legislator is sponsoring a bill that is not going to their committee of jurisdiction, they have absolutely no power to get that bill passed really whatsoever. And once it leaves their hands, what happens to it is totally outside of their control and inside the control of the Committee of Legislation. So one example of that is we had a bill to exempt menstrual products from sales tax. Yeah. That bill got like totally hollowed out. A whole bunch of corporate tax reform got put in there and it got sent along. And so the person who is like the named sponsor on that bill for a long time was like the person associated in the public eye with like all this corporate tax reform. So that is the sort of like basis of how all of the, how it all really happens. And so that's why we're talking to like folks on each committee to say like what they're expecting in the year. Because aside from sort of the Democratic caucus, which happens in 2 weeks, and the power of the speaker, that's like really how a lot of the decisions are made. So on that note, Peter Conlon is going to join us. He's in the waiting room. I'm going to let him in, and then we can talk about the Education Committee a little bit.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Because we always have things to talk about education-wise in Vermont.
We do. We love our schools. And, you know, it's funny, I know I'm like reversing time here because we recorded a show yesterday that we're going to air after this show, but we spent a lot of time last week in my time and next week in listeners' time talking about local control and like our love of our towns. And I think that's an issue that really plays out a lot in our schools that might come up in this conversation today too. Hi, Peter. Welcome to the Montpelier Happy Hour.
Good morning, which is not happy hour time usually, but nice to see you.
Nice to see you. We did, when we first started doing the show, we were airing in the late afternoon on Fridays. and we had a signature cocktail that went with each episode. And we
I
took
have
it pretty seriously.
orange juice today.
Great. And Olga and I then started recording at 7 in the morning, often
Yeah.
on Thursdays, and we were like faking it for a little while, and it got very, very, very silly to like pretend that we were just drinking tea or coffee. But I think Olga's frozen. And so the last for the summer though, we've been designing signature cocktails to go with each conversation we're having. And we have intentions of a cocktail book at some point.
Oh, wow.
We had,
You'd be joining a long list of cocktail books that are out there.
yes. And so Olga's favorite one is the Capricious Veto, which was the cocktail we designed at the end of the last session. And yesterday we had one called Fresh Spirit, I think, that we designed with Mike McCarthy. That was about all the new changes that we're going to experience in the legislature this year.
All right, nice. I like it.
Yeah.
You have to send me the recipe sometime.
I will. So while Olga finds her way back through the internets to the show, I will introduce you, which is usually her job. So want to welcome you, Peter, representative from Cornwall.
Exactly.
Yes, I got it. Awesome.
Yep.
And ranking member on the House Education Committee. We've sort of framed it up for listeners that with all of the changes in the legislature this year, who's on what committee, who's leading what committee is all very up in the air. And so we're
Yes.
talking to folks on each committee who have had some leadership role on that committee and are anticipated to be staying on the committee to see sort of what you're expecting in the new year and what you're talking about.
Great. Yep.
Yeah. So with that, Peter, what are you looking for before we get into policy? Like, so much change. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about the new blood. I'm excited about the larger majority. I'm excited about all the culture change. What are you excited about? Like about all that will be different?
Well, that's a good question. I sort of look at these things with a little bit more dread than excitement sometimes, depending on the mood that I'm in. We got some definite challenges. I think what I'm excited about is that there are some rather interesting issues that we're going to have to wrestle with that are, kind of intellectually interesting, adjusting to federal Supreme Court decisions, things like that. But then also, I think one of the things I'm excited about is we have put out there a lot of money for a lot of programs, and I look forward to hearing how those are doing. We rarely get to hear, when things go right, nobody tells us. They only tell us when things go wrong. So I'm hoping that we'll hear some good news about programs that we put a lot of money into. But of course, these are things that are going to take years to solve, not a summer break.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've been really curious about in the education space is while in a lot of other spaces of state policy, we've had like really tight control of where the money was spent. We told the administration how to spend it, and well, actually often they didn't spend it the way we told them to, but like at least we had intention around tight control. Yeah. In the education space, there was all that ESSER money, like a bunch of rounds that went directly to school districts. And last I heard, I tried to get an update on how that was being spent and didn't get very far. So I'm curious, like, what your understanding of that whole world is.
Well, I'm directly involved in that whole world because I'm a school board member in our school district here. And, I can tell you from our point of view, we have both put it into real tangible things like HVAC systems to have improved ventilation in our schools. But, I think we're no different than anybody else, but we are really targeting it at learning loss that came during COVID. And that includes social and emotional learning as well. So we have invested a lot of money in a lot of people with particular talents to come in and really help us sort of rebuild the social and educational structure within the classroom to provide students with the additional support and help that they might need, which has been great. Now, two issues with that, of course, is that all school districts are doing this. So we've all been fighting for the same pool of applicants. So not every position gets filled that you had hoped to fill. And then the other thing, of course, is that once you have those, boy, they're awfully nice to have. And this was really 2-year funding. get sort of one more school year or fiscal year of funding out of it, and then come the hard decisions about which of that staff that you've brought on can you still afford. But by and large, I think most districts have really spent this money on helping students.
I should maybe know the answer to this question more than you should know the answer to the question, but I don't, so I'm asking you. I'm sorry, Peter. Welcome back, Olga. Do you have a sense of like what percentage of regular education funding the ESSER money represents? Is it like 25% more than we usually spend on education, or?
All right, so no. So if
Okay.
our district is a $39 million budget, and I think we got $2.5 million.
Okay.
Now, proportionally, some districts got a lot more. It was all based on essentially your level of poverty, how you qualify for Title I funding. So proportionally, poorer districts got a lot more than wealthier districts. We tend to be on the upper side of that in the district that I'm in, but other districts really, got a higher percentage of their overall spending.
Yeah, and I know that in my district, at least, a lot of those positions that we invested in were positions that we had really been wanting historically. Like we've been talking for a long time about social workers in every school and increased social emotional learning. And it was the pandemic crisis that made it, and that money that made it possible and necessary. But I think there's been a desire for those positions for a really long time.
Yeah.
So what are other pieces of sort of like that spending and policy making that you're looking forward to checking in on?
Yeah, well, as we look at some of the issues that we're facing, and especially when it comes around spending, one thing we don't talk about that much, but behind the scenes, a lot of work is going in to get a sense of a handle on the situation, and that is construction. We have had a tradition in Vermont of investing really nicely in instruction and not investing very well in keeping up our buildings. And those are local decisions that really reflect school boards saying, we want to invest in our kids to the exclusions often of the long-term upkeep. Because every year you think, well, we can go another year. But, we've already seen a number of bonds proposed. Most have been rejected. We've had others sort of proposed and withdrawn. And so, last we sort of took a quick look, we were looking at $500 million. Well, that didn't include the 110 million that the district that I'm in just calculated its needs are, just to sort of bring all of its schools up to code, current and modern standards, not to turn them into 21st century, show places. So that's something that we're really going to have to look at. It's going to be very challenging. We'll have to talk a lot about maybe a new revenue stream that might support, dedicated revenue stream that might support that. We have, last year we funded a 1-year continuation of the Universal Meals Program.
Whoa, wait, I've
jumped ahead.
Universal Meals.
Yeah.
So there was a multi-year study that on sort of what the state of school infrastructure is, right? Around the state.
Yes. Yeah.
Due on the 15th.
Yeah, the final report is due in a year.
Oh, another.
Yeah. So we have an inventory that's now due, and then we have an assessment that's due. Maybe it's March 2023. It's either March or October 2023.
Okay.
And that's going to be a much more in-depth look at what the needs are.
Okay, because one thought and question I've been having as I think about how we're going to pay for whatever the study is going to say, which I have been thinking about a lot this year, is there's also a PCB inventory, and how that I wonder if those are, when the original school construction study was begun, I don't think there was as much conversation around PCBs, but I imagine a lot of the construction work being done would actually remediate PCBs, and some of the PCB remediation work would help the construction. I wonder how much we're starting to think about overlapping those two conversations.
Well, we're clearly going to have to.
Okay.
The PCB testing program is a little bit behind schedule. It's a slow rollout. And, it's such a huge question mark. We just don't know the level to which. Are we going to have 10 Burlington high school situations, or are we going to have 0? And what we're going to really have is a few windows and other things here and there that need to be remediated. It's a pretty scary question mark. I think as more information on that comes in, but how we're going to make those interlock and overlap is very challenging. We also clearly can't take on $500 million or $700 million worth of school construction like that. We're going to have to come up with a system. Massachusetts has a system where they essentially prioritize and everybody sort of gets where they are, and it's sort of like a nonpartisan base closure commission like we had, and maybe that's what we're going to need to do to deal with school construction.
Yeah, what keeps me up at night worrying about sort of the politics of the school construction issue is there's two things. One, like the idea of relying on local bonding is just like a social cultural equity nightmare, because some districts really can and some can't. And that has very little to do with that district's ability to raise revenue or spend. It's really like just the culture of that community. And that's not fair to the kids that live there. And if we are prioritizing spending, are we going to wind up in like another Act 46 small school closure conversation nightmare? I don't think that's what anyone wants.
No.
And I want to make sure that we are able to have these conversations in like lockstep with the Board of Ed if they're involved, or if there's a nonpartisan committee like you described, Peter, that decides like, how do we make sure that they're actually sensitive to the cultural conversations that are happening in communities and the future demographics of those towns? And then the piece that I feel hopeful about is like, we have a really great new treasurer coming in. He's pretty excited about this. He's very aware of school construction needs. We're already starting to talk. I'm already starting to talk with him about some work that Rhode Island has done on bonding for school construction, how they've sort of navigated some of this. I think they have much newer infrastructure than we do there. But I do think we need to have a whole state approach on it.
Yes.
What this conversation, and hello, Peter, sorry, I had to jump in and jump out. But what this conversation is bringing up for me is I think in Vermont, particularly, we are not good about thinking about the consequences of delayed maintenance or deferred maintenance. And it seems to me like as a reporter, when I cover some of these situations around infrastructure that have reached a critical point, it's because a small decision was delayed to save money, and then it became a bigger decision, and pretty soon the price tag is so high from deferring this maintenance that nobody wants to touch it, understandably. And so it always seems to me like that is something we need to kind of get better about at both the local and the state level.
I totally agree. And I don't think it's entirely like a moral, ethical New England conundrum that we keep on delaying. I think a lot of it is that the decision-making around, a 50-year construction or maintenance plan for a town sits with volunteers who are doing the best they can, but it's very hard to take that kind of long-term view when you're serving a 1 year or 2 year term, right? It's very hard to sort of communicate those long-term needs when you're having sort of the immediate feedback from communities who are scared about their immediate challenges. And as we sort of devolve costs more and more onto local schools and local school districts and local towns and local town decision-making, I think it becomes harder and harder for folks like they don't have multi-year budgets. So how would they have sort of multi-year plans? And I know that some communities have really been able to build that out, but it takes a huge amount of professional capital to do that, I think.
Yeah, as you say, these are generally a small group of local volunteers making these decisions. And when you're faced with, putting a new roof on or laying off a teacher, well, the pressure from the community really is all about, what programs are you cutting for children, to put the new roof on. And, one is a lot easier to vote for than the other.
So we have just a couple minutes before the end of this first segment before we hear from underwriters. So I just wanted to touch base with you, Peter, and you, Emily. Anything you want to tie up for listeners before we head to break?
Peter, do you want to throw your laundry list out now, and then after the break we can talk about the laundry list? Because
that'd be great.
You were only one step into the laundry list when I interrupted.
Oh,
you.
sure. Well, I wasn't that it's not that big. The big topics are, of course, the sort of the three-legged stool of childcare, workforce, and housing. And within that, childcare sort of overlaps into public education because we have a pre-K program. And I know there's going to be a bill that's going to look at perhaps essentially having public school start at age 4 and everything else being called childcare, and sort of dividing those realms up. That's going to be an interesting conversation. The continuation of universal school meals, that's a $30 million cost that we covered for 1 year. And have we now shown that it's effective and worth the money? We've got some interesting Supreme Court reaction to do within our voucher system that we have in Vermont for schools that don't offer a public secondary school, and children can attend the school of their choice. We've got to both figure out how to conform with the U.S. Supreme Court while also maintaining the spirit of our own state constitution that talks about compelled support of religious schools. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, and of course Emily and I have been working together on a committee looking at how we fund education, or raise the money to fund education, whether through property taxes or income taxes.
Thank you, Peter. I want to quickly, before we go, give my apologies for listeners and the guests. My internet satellite literally fell over and I had to go fish it out of a snowbank. And that's why I was disconnected from the show. So thank you everybody for your patience. The Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Welcome back, folks, to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro, as well as Representative Peter Conlon, who is a ranking member on the Ed Committee. And while Emily framed beautifully in the beginning of the show why a lot of committees are in flux right now, thank you, Ed, for joining us to talk about the work he has been doing on the committee and kind of looking forward to some of the possibilities of the legislative session. I just called you Ed. I'm sorry, Peter.
I love it.
You are so at one with your work on the Ed Committee that has become your name.
Just don't call me Mr. Ed.
Okay, I promise. Now you put that thought in my head, though, Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, respectively, and not the station, nor the platform, nor their friends and neighbors.
Thank you very much. Peter, thank you for that laundry list in the first half of the show. For you, remind us how long you've been on the Education Committee.
So I've completed 6 years, so 3 2-year terms.
And for you, it always seems to me that education, and especially funding education, gets a lot of focus in Vermont. But for you, how have you seen the landscape of education change over your 6 years on it as a committee member?
Well, of course, I came into the legislature just as Act 46 was taking effect. And, we seem to have gotten through that. It certainly was a hot topic in your neck of the woods. I live in a region where most of the districts went with the preferred model and had a voluntary merger, and frankly took advantage of some excellent tax benefits as a result. They were very motivating incentives. But that's been adjusting that has been a long, painful process. I think for those who run schools, it has made life much simpler. When you look at a large system that's got multiple elementary schools, maybe a union high school, once you sort of become one unified district, the ability to sort of shift resources effectively becomes something that you can do. And I think really, we adjusted to Act 46, went through sort of the painful process, and then the COVID pandemic hit, and then all of a sudden those tools became available. And I think if you were to talk with educators as opposed to school board members, they would say, we were lucky to have it. We have been able to deploy resources where they were needed much more easily than having to work through a series of school boards to make that happen, who are all individual employers. So that's been, very interesting to watch. And of course, just all of the recovery from COVID has changed the landscape dramatically. I think coming up, we're going to have a lot of conversations about our system in Vermont for those schools that don't operate their own school and essentially use vouchers to send kids to other schools, and where that money goes. I think in the early days, that was really meant as a way to send your kid to the neighboring public school or perhaps one of our 4 historic academies. But it has grown into something where kids are going to elite prep schools, they're going overseas, they're going to ski academies, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily was in the spirit of the tradition of our program. And I think that that's going to be up for a lot of debate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Peter. I'll just share with folks, for me personally, making sure our public schools are healthy and students are thriving is so crucial, because when I was in elementary school, I was at a school that I was not thriving at for a host of reasons. And my mom, to the point that my mother actually got a job at a private school so that I could get tuition deferral and go to this private school. So I have seen what happens when kids can't thrive at their public schools. And so I just think it's so important that we care for them.
Yeah, and
Go
I
ahead.
think we've started to do a lot of really, really good work to ensure safety of kids, like not just physical safety, but emotional safety of kids in our schools. We've done a lot of work around suspensions and expulsions. We've done a lot of work around social emotional competencies. We've done a lot of work around strengthening integration with social service systems. There's a lot more to do. And, I think some of the pluses of Act 46 that Peter talked about, where we, in a tiny town, it's really hard to have enough resources to meet the needs of every kid in that community. And so the more we can share resources across town boundaries and across community boundaries, I think the better we can meet the needs of the little Olgas of the world.
the little sensitive Olgas. Yes.
Yeah. And, as we're having this the conversation around how we spend the money, and making sure that if we're spending state dollars, which again is not just the tax dollars of the individual community, it's the tax dollars of every Vermont taxpayer, every property taxpayer in the state, making sure that all of that money is being spent accountably, which is something that we really do in our public schools, but becomes less clear when we're talking about the voucher system, what we're really necessarily getting for those communities' dollars. And then we're moving into this conversation around the income-based education tax, which is a wild and fascinating journey that Peter and I are on together right now.
Yes, just for the sake of listeners, both Emily and Peter serve on a study committee looking at what it would take or what it would mean to transfer our historic property tax, education property tax, into an income-based one. Update listeners, where is that process at?
Yeah, so historically, both the homestead property tax and the non-homestead property tax both go into the education fund, and then it's dispersed out to districts based on essentially how much district budgets have been voted on. So how much that district decided it needed is how much the education fund sends back out after receiving money from homestead and non-homestead property taxes. When that's all Act 60, basically. When the original Act 60, and then those property tax rates at the local level are, I'm going to try to do this quickly. Those property tax rates at the local level are the homestead tax rate at the local level is adjusted based on how much that district spent and then the demographics of that district.
Mhm.
Some folks, and then as part of that adjusting, some folks, essentially, if you make around less than $100,000 a year in your household, you pay that adjusted rate based on what your income is, a percentage of your income essentially. And then folks who make more than that pay based on a rate connected to their property value, which is also adjusted. So basically, some people pay based on their income, some people pay based on their property value. It depends on how much money you make. If you make less than a certain amount of money, you don't pay any property taxes at all because of something called a circuit breaker. When Act 60 originally passed the House, but did not, was headed over to the Senate, instead of this system, it actually was an entirely income-based education tax. And ever since the Senate changed that, there have been folks floating through the legislature and floating around the legislature, the Vermont NEA included, and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, who have wanted to bring that idea back and move to an entirely income-based system of education taxes, not a property tax-based system of education taxes. Again, this is just the homestead rate we're talking about, which is folks who live in their homes the majority of the year, not the non-homestead rate, which includes second homes and rentals and commercial property.
Thank you.
So that's what we're doing. I think right now, Peter, we are like thrashing our way through a rainforest of administrative and logistical challenges.
I think we've done an excellent job of studying systems that won't work.
Well, that's good. That's good to know what won't work.
and frankly, what we have learned, and for those of us who are deep in it, not that big a surprise, but the system that we have is actually fairly progressive. But it still is A, very difficult to understand, and B, not as sort of fair as it could be if we went to an income-based system. And I think we've got sort of the skeleton there, but it always sort of boils down to, okay, who's going to do what and how are you going to do it?
Yeah, there's an assumption built into our entire wild Vermont system that Vermonters are making decisions about their school budgets in an informed way that is deeply tied to their assumption of how that would impact their property tax rate.
Right.
That people are like rational actors operating with perfect information in the system. That is like built into the story we tell about all of this. I personally think that's mostly a farce, but I can't really do anything about the fact that I think that's mostly a farce. I think people make decisions about whether they vote up or down their school budgets based on like a whole wider set of cultural signifiers and stories they have.
Yep.
But if we believe that assumption, then we should be working to make the communication and the connection much, much deeper and clearer to people. And that's one of the reasons there's pressure to move towards this more transparent system where everyone be on the same base. And there's sort of like a cliff around property taxes when people move from sort of that income base to that property base around $100,000 a year of household income, maybe actually around like $75,000 a year of household income. And so there's concern about that sort of some people, like the burden is being borne in our property tax system for families between like about $45,000 a year and about $75,000 a year. And that's sort of a cohort in Vermont that's already struggling with a lot of other financial stuff.
Yeah.
But it is like a nasty, terrible thicket of administrative wild, like every little thing you pull comes. There's a reason it hasn't happened yet. And it's not just people's views on taxes. It's not just like politics and morality and justice. Very much, if it was easy to do, it would have been done already.
Yes.
And do I dare ask how this conversation around income-based taxes versus property-based taxes and the changing the weights around how we weight pupils Do I dare ask how those two are dovetailing or bouncing off each other, or?
They can dovetail. I think we have to be careful to make sure the implementation timelines line up so we don't like layer confusion upon confusion. They wouldn't, it wouldn't mess with sort of the pupil weighting is how we count pupils in order to like sort of figure out tax responsibility. And so it wouldn't really, it would not mess with that is basically the long and short of it. Though what it will mess with is the variability from community to community of their tax rates is going to widen a lot. And so some of the administrative challenges around like the amount of withholding get more difficult when that variability expands, which is like a little too even deep dorky for this show.
I didn't think there was such a thing.
Emily, would you agree that that if we move forward with a change that is probably going to take the full biennium, or do you think we can get it done in one session?
I think it would definitely take the full biennium. Yes.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, if we did it. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I can imagine that part of what it will take is, you know, outreach to communities. So people, as you said, people can understand it. I mean, I often feel, and again, this just comes from me sitting in the back row of town meeting, covering it for the newspaper. But I often feel that a lot of the frustration people have with school budgets is more because they don't understand how the money is flowing through the system. It's not for many people a clear, okay, I pay this money and I see where the money goes and I see the results. You know, I think for a lot of people that's just an unclear process, and I think that's where a lot of the frustration comes from.
I agree.
Just
and
at the local level.
I also don't know if like this is I think it's sometimes in people's best interest to obfuscate what is not as complicated as the system as sometimes we make it out to be. I also am concerned that if we implement this, I think one of the reasons that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and a lot of other people are excited about it is it makes more opportunity to more space for property taxes, right? At the town level. And towns are really desperate for revenue right now for good reason. They're holding the burden of a lot more of our, you know, community struggles than necessarily, I mean, should necessarily. But our town-based property taxes are not set up as progressively as our education-based property taxes. And so right now it's a fairly small fraction of the overall property tax burden. I mean, not very small, but it's, you know, it's a smaller piece of the property tax burden that households hold. But if it's going to increase and isn't set up with the same kind of progressive scaling that we have in our education property tax, what is going to be the implication of that for a household overall tax responsibility and the shape of our taxes throughout the state in terms of like when we layer them all up, how progressive are they? So that's something we haven't even talked about on the committee, but I feel sort of background nervous about.
How about you, Peter? Has that, what, you know, what Emily has said, what concerns or thoughts are coming up for you?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Emily said. And it is, you know, we just talked a lot about how is it that people decide whether they're going to vote yay or nay on a school budget. And, you know, are they looking at their sort of overall tax burden between property taxes, income taxes, and everything? Or are they just sort of saying an 8% increase? Well, hell no on that. Or, you know, gee, our school system continues to produce great kids. Absolutely. So I do agree that I'm not sure we're going to make it any simpler to know that. One of the discussions that we also have a lot of is wanting to tie people, as Emily said, to make them understand what the impact of their vote is on their own situation. And, you know, using an individual income tax is potentially better for that. The timing, there are some timing issues. Often what we do with budgets now is we look at, okay, well, what's our school district have for a property tax rate? What's our neighboring school district have? And we sort of say, we sort of put ourselves relative to everybody else, rather than looking at our own personal situation relative to what our, you know, situation is. So it's, you know, it is really challenging. We certainly have discovered that you can't be both progressive, fair, and simple. And, so I'm not sure we're going to make it any easier for people, but hopefully we can make it fairer for people.
Mhm. So what is that, the saying, we used to say this in the film industry, good, fast, cheap, pick two?
Yeah.
Is that kind of thing, progressive, fair, simple, pick two?
Yes,
Yeah,
that is.
it really
So
is.
it's, yeah, there's sort of three legs of the school equity, the school thing, school finance thing. And it is simple, equitable. And what is the third one? I just lost it, Peter.
Fast. Well, in ours, it's fair,
Yeah.
progressive, and
Yeah.
easy to understand.
So we were talking, and then another big piece is before we get to school lunches, actually, which I think is a great conversation to have, and something that I think a lot of folks care a lot about. I know last biennium, the entire education community turned out and said, like, please, 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 for the love that all of it is holy, don't mess with us this year. We are too tired.
Fair enough. I could see why they might say that.
Fair enough. And I think everyone is like still, and I work with our local school district in a professional capacity somewhat, and I'm fairly sure they're all like exactly and maybe even more tired than they were before. So have you like already heard that feedback? How are you thinking about sort of that piece of the puzzle, Peter?
Surprisingly, I have that pleading has not happened yet. I fully expect it because I agree. Folks may even be more tired. I mean, especially as we continue to struggle just for human beings to be in our school system, to work. That in and of itself is exhausting. So, therefore, I believe if we can look at issues that are sort of outside the management of classrooms, all the better. And I'm talking about things like school construction, dealing with the income-based education tax, looking toward the future with other things. I think everybody sort of feels, yes, we need to tackle those. They don't really mess with the education of children for the time being. And that may be the way we go. Plus we put a lot of money out there. They've received a lot of money. We sort of need to follow up to make sure that those programs are working.
So we have just over 5 minutes before the end of the show. So I just wanted to give that time notice, since you mentioned you might want to talk about school lunches.
Peter, what do you want to say about school meals?
School meals. So just a quick background, we had a federal program during COVID that covered everybody's meals. That ended at the end of the last fiscal year. The legislature, flush with money in the education fund, decided to fund it for one more year, really with the hopes of gathering a lot more information about how we can make it work in the future. How much is it really going to cost the state to do it? Maine has implemented it. They've come up with their philosophy being, we spend so many hundreds of millions of dollars on these students. Let's at least spend a little bit to make sure they're classroom ready by giving them some food. I think that's an excellent point of view. It's a good investment. They get a lot more federal aid for their meals, so it's a lot less expensive than it is for us. So the question is are we prepared to continue funding it? I think it's something that everybody has gotten used to. I think we have only heard very positive things about its impact. I hope we can continue to make it happen. We don't have the fiscal numbers yet, and we don't have yet the information we need to sort of say, here's what it will look like going forward.
So fascinatingly, this is the single issue I've heard the most about in support from constituents, more than abortion rights, more than guns, more than like anything, school lunches. And like part of that is just like, I think the folks working on this do a very good job in getting the word out. More than child treatment, which is another like, is probably the best funded lobby in the state. And there's this really interesting piece of this whole thing, Peter, like connected to sort of the administration of our state programs. That's been sort of a theme, I think, this fall on the happy hour. And you said Maine gets a lot more federal money. Part of it is we get federal money based on how well we count kids who are financially eligible.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked a lot before on the show about like poverty and shame and applications and applying for programs and declaring that you're a person who needs it and saying that in a small town and like just all of the really terrible dynamics of that. And so it's great because the actual provision of meals and universal meals like takes away all of that. Everyone just gets the food and gets to eat it. But the need to track data around who is eligible for it is still a really important part of bringing federal money to pay for it. And so I think we had a lot of hope. I had a lot of hope. I don't know if you had a lot of hope, Peter. I'm like, I think I'm slightly more like hopes and dreams kind of gal than you are. But that we were going to be able to really improve the administration of that paperwork and simplify those forms in order to get more people to fill them out. And it's not clear to me if that part has really taken place this last year. It seems perhaps it hasn't.
Yeah, and a lot of that is, a lot of this gets tied up in federal bureaucracy as well. Yeah, and well, this is probably one of the things we're going to dive into first to see where we're at.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Peter. Again, just a few minutes before the end of the show, we've pulled a lot of strings. Anything you want to make sure listeners
I have a question for Peter to wrap up with. It's
good.
Peter, what do you think it'll be like to have so many more members who are actively parenting children who are going to school in the legislature this next year? How will that change our conversations?
It's going to be very interesting. I helped somebody from a neighboring community campaign, and she mostly goes around with her baby in a baby Bjorn, and so I think it's going to be great. It's going to be hard for them, and I really hope they can pull it off because that perspective is incredibly important. They're the ones who are going to be the beneficiaries or the sufferers of whatever we do, probably more so than somebody my age. It's going to be fascinating. I just hope we can have the supports in place to make it work. Hopefully technology will help solve some of the real challenges. We'll see.
I think we've talked a lot about, at least like with Chloe Leary down here in Windham County, about employer sponsored daycare. I think the State House, is there a room that you could turn into a daycare center?
There's not even room there's no room anywhere in the legislature. But also, I think for elementary school age kids, there's still a lot of parenting time that's spent on elementary school and middle school age children and high school age children that on-site daycare would not help. And you would need to have the breaks in your legislative day to go attend to the child in the on-site daycare. So yeah, I don't know if that's.
I was envisioning this great pilot program.
It would be the sweetest. I mean, I would improve my day, but
but not feasible, huh? Well, Representative Peter Conlon, so glad you could join us today. Thanks for Zooming with us. If people want to learn more about the Ed Committee or learn more about your work, how can they do that?
Well, one thing that the state does well, at least the legislature, is we've got an excellent website where you can go to various committees. You can look and see what's there. It needs to be refreshed for our next biennium. So folks may want to wait until January till that happens, but it lists everything that's going on in every committee all the time. And now with all of our great technology, folks can tune in and listen to what's going on live. They can watch people testify after hours if they're so inclined. But the public accessibility to what we do everywhere throughout the legislature is a complete change from what it was 5 years ago. And it's really quite amazing.
Thank you. Emily, if people want to learn more about you or reach out to you, how can they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and find links to all the ways to communicate with me, as well as my newsletter. Signing up for my newsletter, which is sort of every couple weeks. And then you are also the Ways and Means website and the Joint Fiscal Office website is sort of where my work happens. So the Income-Based Education Committee, if folks want to follow that, that's actually on the Joint Fiscal Office website, not the legislative website. But lots of fun links there to lots of great studies. And, if you're having trouble sleeping, also some of those YouTube videos are good stuff.
And thank you. Well, beautiful people, that's all the time we have here on the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on BCTV as well as wherever you find your podcasts if you would like to subscribe. Until next week, take care.